Okay, so video 2, we're going to be talking about still about the brainstem, but now we're going to talk about the midbrain, which is the top portion of the brainstem. So as we can see, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, we won't really be able to see well on this model. But we're going to start with the tectum. And so there's two sections of the midbrain, and that's the tectum and the tegmentum. And so the tectum it literally means roof. So it's the top of the midbrain, and then tegmentum kind of confusingly means covering. So it kind of covers the hindbrain, and then the tectum is the roof for the whole of the brainstem. And in the tectum, there's well, I guess two structures that I'm going to talk about. And that's the superior and the inferior colliculi. And so they appear as 4 bumps on the dorsal surface of the brainstem. And they're symmetrically positioned, one on either side of the midline of the brainstem. And so we have to take off the cerebellum to see these. So they're rostral or anterior to the cerebellum, and then they are posterior or caudal to the pons. And so you can't really tell very well on this model, but they would be right here. So let's look at those on our screen. So this is really a great picture showing the superior and inferior colliculi. And so the superior, they're called superior because they're on top of, and inferior because they're below. So here we've got the superior and the inferior colliculi. And again, this is a posterior view of the brainstem. And let's see, I think I might have another. No, maybe that's it. This is a clear photo of those. So yeah, what are the superior and inferior colliculi for? The inferior colliculi are part of the auditory system, playing a role in our hearing. And then the superior colliculi are a part of the visual system. So yeah, primarily involved in our visual reflexes and our reactions to moving stimuli. The superior colliculi is thought to help orient the head and the eyes towards something that is seen and heard. And so damage to the tectum of the midbrain, one way that might present is as, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correct, but Perinaud's syndrome. And this is a syndrome where the patient will be unable to gaze upwards or downwards. And, you know, at first that seems a little random, but when you think about how the superior colliculi is involved in visual reflexes and reactions to moving stimuli, you could see how something going wrong or being damaged could sort of snap something and cut off your ability to gaze upwards or downwards, which would be pretty unfortunate. Yeah. So let's move down to the tegmentum, which is beneath the tectum. And the first, we're going to talk about a few structures. So the reticular formation, the periaqueductal gray matter, and the red nucleus, and the substantia nigra. So we won't really be able to see all of those on here because they're really, they're inside, they're medial, I think would be the way to say it. And so let's look at all of these structures before talking about them on an image. Where is it? Okay, here we go. So here we've got the cerebral aqueduct, which we'll talk more about in a later video. But surrounding that, we have the periaqueductal gray matter. And the periaqueductal gray matter consists mostly of cell bodies of neurons that surround the cerebral aqueduct. And the cerebral aqueduct here is traveling from the third to the fourth ventricle. And yes, it's called gray matter because it's mostly cell bodies as opposed to nerve fibers, I think, white matter. Anyways, yeah, so periaqueductal gray matter surrounding the cerebral aqueduct, and then we have the red nucleus down here and here, and then yeah, so the red nucleus is a bundle of axons that arises from the red nucleus. And yeah, we'll talk in a second a little bit more about the red nucleus, but then also the substantia nigra is right here in this area. So did we mention the reticular formation? Here we've got the reticular formation up here. I forgot to mention that. So yeah, up in this area. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing and talk a little. Well, I can leave this image up for now. So yeah, the reticular formation, we'll just start there. And this is a large structure that consists of many nuclei, over 90. And it also is characterized by a diffuse interconnected network of neurons. And these are neurons with complex dendritic and axonal processes. And so reticulum, very tellingly, means little net, which helps us to visualize these complex networks of neurons. And the reticular formation occupies the core of the brainstem. If you remember in our last video, I brought up the reticular formation passing through both the pons and the medulla. And so it is critical in these very brainstem-like functions of significant importance. So it receives sensory information by means of various pathways and projects axons to the cerebral cortex, to the thalamus, and to the spinal cord. So important messaging functions for pivotal basic operations. So yeah, it plays a role in sleep and arousal, and attention, and movement, muscle tonus, and a variety of other vital reflexes. And it plays a role in filtering incoming stimuli to discriminate what is irrelevant background. So yeah, and this is evolutionarily one of the oldest parts of the brain. So very important. A little more detail on some of these small neural networks and their functions. One of the big ones is somatic motor control. So some motor neurons send their axons to the reticular formation nuclei, giving rise to tracts of the spinal cord. And these tracts play a large role in maintaining tone, balance, and posture during movement. And reticular formation also relays ear and eye signals to the cerebellum so that visual, auditory stimuli can be integrated in motor coordination. And the other motor nuclei include gaze centers, which enables the eyes to track and fixate objects, and central pattern generators, which produce rhythmic signals to the muscles of breathing and swallowing. Reticular formation also plays a role in cardiovascular control, and also in pain modulation. The reticular formation is one means by which pain signals from the lower body reach the cerebral cortex. And it also is the origin of the descending analgesic pathways. So the nerve fibers in these pathways act in the spinal cord to block the transmission of some pain signals to the brain. Another big thing with the reticular formation is sleep and consciousness. Like we talked about with pons, sleep and consciousness is a big role in the brain stem, but the reticular formation has projections to the thalamus and the cerebral cortex that allow it to exert some control over which sensory signals reach the cerebrum and come to our conscious attention. It plays a central role in states of consciousness because of this, like alertness and sleep. An injury to the reticular formation can result in an irreversible coma. Last thing I'll talk about is habituation. And so this is a process in which the brain learns to ignore repetitive, meaningless stimuli while remaining sensitive to others. And a good example of this is when a person can sleep through loud traffic in a large city, but is awakened promptly by the sound of an alarm or a crying baby. And so, yeah, the reticular formation nuclei that modulate activity of the cerebral cortex are a part of the reticular activating system. So all of this shows that the reticular formation is a really critical structure, which we could call a network of important nuclei. So next, and we're going to talk more briefly about these last structures, the periaqueductal gray matter, which I mentioned earlier, consists of cell bodies of neurons surrounding the cerebral aqueduct. Basically, these neural circuits control sequences of movements that specifically constitute species typical behaviors, such as fighting and mating. So again, involved in movement and behavior, very brain stem-like structure. And then the red nucleus and the substantia nigra are the last things we're going to talk about. These are important components of the motor system as well. So a bundle of axons that arises from the red nucleus constitutes one of the two major fiber systems that bring motor information from the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum to the spinal cord. So this is descending information. And the substantia nigra contains neurons whose axons project to the caudate nucleus and the putamen, which are parts of the basal ganglia, which we'll talk about, I think, in our next video. And so the substantia nigra is a critical brain region for, and this is important for us as psychologists to know about, the substantia nigra is a critical brain region for the production of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And this neurochemical affects many systems of the central nervous system, ranging from movement control, cognitive executive functions, and the emotional limbic activity. And degeneration of these neurons is what causes Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by these sort of difficulties with movement and muscles and tics and facial movements and difficulties with tongue control and all of these things that are all related to movement. And so this sort of closes out our second video on the brainstem, this one focusing on the midbrain. But as we see over both videos, a very primary role of the brainstem is in relation to basic movement. And yeah, like our professor told us, the brain developed primarily to help with movement. And so this being the first evolutionary part of the brain, the brainstem, or I guess the hindbrain is the last video, makes sense that it would focus on movement.